Welcome to Out of the Best Books, where we pull a book down from the Deseret Book Library and let it kick off thoughtful conversations. I'm Cole Wissinger.
And I'm Sarah Collins. And speaking of thoughtful, this is an interesting topic because in the whole of the Doctrine and Covenants, there are only two women mentioned by name. Of course, Emma Smith, we probably all recognize, but the other is someone that we're going to talk about today, and she deserves her name to be mentioned as well.
And that takes us to Brent Rogers, a historian and author of a book titled The Lord Spoke Her Name. And so we will as well. It's the remarkable story of Vienna Jaques in the Restoration. It tells about some of the events in church history that you are familiar with, and some that you may not be, all with the perspective of one early convert. It is Vienna Jaques. And so welcome, Brent.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So exciting to have you here. I'm personally so intrigued by this story. Like we said, we mentioned there's two women mentioned by name in the Doctrine and Covenants. And admittedly, I didn't even know Vienna's was mentioned by name. I'm not brushed up quite on my Doctrine and Covenants, I guess.
No, I don't think you're alone in that. Most of the conversations that I have with people when I talk about Vienna, they are a little taken aback to learn that there are only two women mentioned by name in the sections that comprise the Doctrine and Covenants. So you're not alone.
Okay. Thank you for relieving me as a woman for not knowing that.
At the start of the podcast, we can give a similar preamble that you do in the start of your book. So I listened to the audiobook version of this, and had I read it, I probably would have been pronouncing her name in my head Jaques or Jaques. But because it was your voice that read it, you give this at the beginning of your book. Would you explain, like, most people are saying Jaques, and so that's what we will do as well, right?
Yes. One of the things I'm asked most often is how to pronounce Vienna's last name.
Yeah.
And given the contemporary evidence, her last name is spelled by her contemporaries in a few different ways, including Jaques, Jakes, which is, for me, the easiest to pronounce. And so that's the one that I go with. There's also spellings such as Jaques and Jaques. It's easiest for me to say Jaques, and since there's contemporary historical evidence to support that, that's what I go with.
And this won't be the last time that documentation is maybe a little bit faulty on the story of Vienna Jaques, which we can maybe use this as a jumping off point to get to what got you into this kind of study. It was a tombstone that had the wrong dates on it.
Yes. So the tombstone comes actually a little bit later in my story of getting to know Vienna. I first started to get to know Vienna working on the Joseph Smith Papers project. A little over 13 years ago, I started working for the Joseph Smith Papers, and one of the first volumes that I was assigned to was working on the 1833 documents of Joseph Smith. And in that corpus is a letter that Joseph wrote to Vienna Jaques on September 4th, 1833. And as I was working on that letter, I realized that there isn't a whole lot written about Vienna, even though we have this great letter that Joseph writes to her, and she's mentioned in the section of the Doctrine and Covenants. As I was continuing research on Vienna, I went to, see her headstone at the Salt Lake City Cemetery. And when I arrived, I saw this very small headstone depressed in the ground, and engraven upon it was the incorrect year of her birth, which troubled me and actually kind of upset me. It has on there 1833, which is the year of the revelation that mentions her name, but she was actually born on June 10, 1787, and has about a 40 plus year period of her life that she lives before she even knows about the restored gospel.
Really quick, Brent, will you tell us that section of the Doctrine and Covenants for the listener to go straight to?
Oh, sure. Yes, it's Doctrine and Covenants section 90. And if you go to verses 28 through 31, that's where you'll see Vienna's name and then the revelatory counsel that's given to her.
Okay. So I guess we're getting into where your origin of meeting Vienna was and how you kind of became more interested in her. But again, we said I've not really heard of her. She's relatively anonymous for probably most the average Latter-day Saint, right?
Yes.
So I guess the core question is, who is Vienna?
Yeah, great question. Since I wrote a whole book about her, I'm going to try to be brief and give you a bit of a shortened version of it. But she's a woman who grew up in Massachusetts. Don't know a whole lot about her early life just because there are not a lot of records that are associated with her. I found a few genealogical records and a city directory that helped, create some of the puzzle pieces to understanding her early life. But for the first 40 years of her life, she lived in Massachusetts and was a very thrifty, resolute, hardworking, self-reliant woman who just has this incredible work ethic. And she accumulated quite a bit of wealth for the day, including a couple of properties in Boston, Massachusetts, and in Providence, Rhode Island. And so she's in her 40s, a member of a Methodist Episcopal church in Boston. And she's a spiritual seeker. She's looking for more. She's dissatisfied with the teachings that she's finding with her current faith. And she reads in the newspaper about the Book of Mormon and about Joseph Smith, and it intrigues her. She has an interest in divine healing and in revelatory power. And this new book of scripture that is brought forth by revelation is very intriguing to her. She gets a copy of the Book of Mormon, and kind of an interesting part of the story is as much as she was interested in it, she flips through the pages and isn't immediately drawn into the book, which sort of surprised me when I learned that. But she has the prompting to read it very thoroughly and read it again. And she said at that time, her mind was illuminated about the truthfulness of this new scripture. So she, a single woman in her 40s, travels from Boston to Kirtland, Ohio, where Joseph Smith and the church were at the time. And she goes to see for herself what this faith group is doing and what they're teaching. And shortly after her arrival there in July 1831, she is baptized into the new faith by Emer Harris, who's a brother of Martin Harris. Before she heads back to Boston, she meets Joseph Smith for the first time, and he teaches her about the concept of gathering and building Zion. So Vienna comes to Kirtland at a time when the saints have been commanded by revelation to build a house of the Lord, to build a temple, but they don't have the means to do that. And trying to find the means to do that is a difficult thing. And Vienna comes with some wealth that she brings with her from her earlier life in Boston and Rhode Island, and she donates her wealth to the church, which Joseph Smith and others then use that to purchase land to build the Kirtland Temple. But Vienna leaves before that is completed, because there's a whole segment of saints gathering to Jackson County, Missouri, where Revelation had said where Zion would be. This is where we were gathering to build Zion. And so there's movement of church members from Kirtland, from other parts of the United States and eventually the world. They were moving to Missouri to participate in the building up of the church there. And part of the revelation that mentions her by name says that she is to go to Missouri and to meet with the bishop and to get an inheritance of land. And then she is to do that. She leaves within the next couple of months. And by the summer of 1833, she's now moved from Boston to Kirtland, Ohio, to Jackson County, Missouri. And this is when the violence against the saints there erupts. Just within weeks of her arriving, the non-Latter-day Saint members of the community are going out of their way to try to expel the saints from their homes. And she experiences a very chaotic and difficult day when those folks attack church members in their home. They attack William W. Phelps's printing office and destroy the equipment for printing the church's newspaper there and the book of Revelations that he was printing for the church. And there's this moment that is, I think of it as a very terrifying moment. In the historical record, there's a mobber is menacingly hovering over Vienna Jaques as she's in the streets trying to collect the pages of the book of Revelations, the book of commandments that contain Joseph Smith's revelations. And he stands over her and says, "Madam, this is only a prelude to what you have to suffer." And you think about her being in that space in that moment of, wow, I've given up a lot to come here, but she sees in the very next scene that she talks about, Edward Partridge, who's the bishop who she was supposed to see when she goes to Missouri, who had just been tarred and feathered, is walking away from this experience, and she sees him encircled in a bright light, a crown of glory for the tar and feathers that he received. She's immediately buoyed in her faith in that moment, even though you have this terrifying encounter. And I think that, as I understand church history, that's kind of how things went for the saints, is that they were doing their best to build Zion, and they kept having these encounters, violent encounters, things that were trying to put them down that I don't want to say should have destroyed faith, but could have very easily destroyed faith. And God reveals himself in ways to help them to suffer through these things with their faith intact. And that's how I see Vienna in that moment. And she has the strength to move forward.
It's an interesting snapshot into life as a Latter-day Saint, and you've picked Vienna's story to kind of use that. I want to take a step back. So what did you learn about yourself, I guess, from studying this part of her story and how her faith buoyed her and she continued on and here's a message from a person telling her, this is just the start of your hardship and suffering, because we're not going to make it easy for you. What does that kind of teach you about our own legacy as being members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
For me, I would say that I find as incredible and as remarkable of a journey as Vienna has, I also find it very relatable, because I think what I take away from her story is that she shows sort of this everyday heroism of living a faithful life. And I think that's something that we can all take. Like, we can see challenges that we face in our own lives and have sort of everyday struggles. Vienna had those too. And maybe, our struggles aren't somebody menacingly hovering over us, telling us that we're going to endure, a lot more for our faith, but maybe we're, attacked in different ways, or we have different thoughts that lead us down dark roads. But there are things that happen every day that challenge us. And Vienna had things that were frequently challenging her. And she chose to endure in her faith. She chose to contribute in the ways that she could to build Zion. And she made efforts, some large, like we talked about, donating a lot of money to purchase land to build a temple, and others that were small, like when she's in Salt Lake City and her Relief Society donating milk from her cows or things that she's grown on her property, and just little ways that she can go and provide care to an ailing neighbor. These are all everyday things that we all can do, great and small, to live our lives of faith. And I think that's the thing that I see most prominent in Vienna's life is, you talk about her having this anonymity. She's not, the story that gets told from the pulpit all the time. She's not general conference subject of the Willie and Martin handcart companies, like these kind of things that we often turn to as examples of living through trying times. But her whole life shows us the same thing, is that it requires everyday acts of heroism to live faithful lives. And so I think in that way, it makes me feel really good. Like, hey, if I'm still moving forward in my faith, like that's a heroic thing. I take a lot of solace, a lot of encouragement in Vienna's example to say, I can move forward, because she moved forward facing the odds that she did, so can I. And that's what I think is great about history and church history.
And you mentioned she has a couple stories when they reach the Salt Lake Valley as well. Because the timeline of the Doctrine and Covenants kind of peters out after Joseph Smith is martyred and when the saints get to Salt Lake, I kind of also expected your book to end when we reached this final destination and everyone lived happily ever after. But she continued as an elderly lady in Utah for quite some time, and her story continues. This is kind of a part of church history that we don't get as much in the Sunday school lessons. And so could you just give us some insight on what that church looked like for the saints in the early years through Vienna's eyes?
Yes, there's some really great letters that Vienna writes to Brigham Young that give us some real insight into what life was like. I'll take one of those examples. She is trying to build her home and some buildings on her property for animals, and she's having a bit of a difficult encounter with somebody she's hired to build those things. And this person is maybe trying to take advantage of this woman who's a little bit older, who's single, but who has said, "Hey, I need some help," and he's asking for more money and not doing a very good job with the work that he is doing. And so she goes to her bishop, and the bishop talks with the man and says, "Well, I talked to him, and there's not a lot we can do here. You just have to go on." Well, Vienna's like, "Well, I'm going to write a letter to Brigham Young and say, hey, this is the scenario. Can you please interject here and try to help me out, because I'm being taken advantage of and it's not right." And the resolution of this is that Brigham Young and the bishop of Vienna's ward meet with this brother and say, "Hey, you're not doing right by her." And he agrees to take a little bit less money and to finish the work. Now, as I read it, if I'm Vienna, I would say, I'm not sure that totally is adequate, but it's better than what he was trying to do to me, right? And so it's not maybe like the happiest go lucky story of, and she appealed to Brigham Young and he came in and made everything perfect. But he did try to ameliorate the situation. And I think it was somewhat satisfactory all the way around. And Vienna ended up with a nice house, some nice outbuildings for her animals, and she continued to move on. But I think the reason I bring that one up is because it does speak to, this is the sort of the ways, there's so much intertwined between what's happening on somebody's property and what is happening with communication between church leaders. And then, I can't imagine having a dispute on my property today and even talking to the bishop about it, right? It's like, oh, if that's a property dispute, that's on me to figure out.
That's the HOA's job.
Right. Like, there was just so much entwined. And I think bishops and even the prophet were involved in church members' lives in a way that was a little bit more intimate than we would think of today. And I think there's some really cool aspects of that. And with Vienna's story, you actually see quite a bit of this. She reaches out to Brigham Young on another time when, like, look, I have this cow that is not producing any milk, and I need some milk for the winter. And she's seeking for some help there because no one in her ward or neighborhood will trade with her or barter with her or help her out. And then you have where she has an excess of milk another year, and Brigham Young writes to her, says, "Hey, how you doing? Do you need any milk for the winter?" And she's like, "You know what? I'm doing great. I've actually just gone around to my neighbors and given them a bunch of milk and dairy products, and we're doing good." And so you see a dynamic of church history and the interconnectedness of lives in the Salt Lake Valley at that time.
And especially for a woman for whom Zion was so important, like the gathering and the Zion of it was vital to her. She got to experience that in the early stages where Zion would be a community where your church leaders, your political leaders, your HOA, everything is kind of rolled into one hopefully happy working machine.
Right. And it wasn't always, happy, and it wasn't always running very smoothly. And sometimes, there new things came up, new things happened. One of the things that I like to tell people a lot when I talk to them about the past is, there was no handbook, right?
Right.
We go to the handbook for the answers to so many questions anymore, but there was no handbook then. Things were happening sort of in real time. And, one of the examples in the book that speaks to this very well is Vienna's being present for the first baptism for the dead. And she, very interested in this idea of the salvation for her deceased kin. And she gets word that a woman named Jane Nyman is being baptized for her deceased son, Cyrus, in the Mississippi River. And she gets on her horse and rides, as fast as she can to be there to see this thing happen. After she rides into the river. It's the cover art for the book actually depicts this scene. And I think Anthony Sweat's image there is beautiful, and it does a good job of kind of setting up the scene for the whole book in this way of the development of the church and Vienna's role in it. She very closely observes and witnesses the event and the ordinance as it takes place. And then later that evening, Joseph Smith hears that this has taken place and asks about how it was done. Jane Nyman and Harvey Olmsted, who is the gentleman who baptized Jane, gave their account. And then Vienna was asked about it. And she said, this is how he said the prayer, and this is how it was done. And Joseph says, that's right. That's how it should be done. Maybe not the way we would think that a new ordinance would develop. But thinking about it in that way, you see the role of sort of these everyday people in the development of the work of God.
So beautiful. In Doctrine and Covenants 90, where Vienna's name is mentioned, in verse 29, I just like the wording here. It says, the residue of the money may be consecrated unto me, and she'll be rewarded in mine own due time. Well, from what you've learned about Vienna and her fantastic story, what's maybe been the thing about her character that's resonated the most with you?
Well, if you go on in the section, I think it helps explain exactly that, because it goes on to say in verse 31 that she may settle down in peace, inasmuch as she is faithful, and not be idle in her days from thenceforth. And I mean, if I could describe Vienna Jaques in what is that she lived up to that revelation for the remainder of her life, as far as I've been able to tell. She is faithful and she is never idle, always trying to do good works to bless the lives of others. There's a quote that she gives in a Relief Society meeting in Salt Lake City, where she's telling the group of women there that they should never be afraid to do good, because when they do good, you're doing the things of the Lord. And when you're not doing good, you're letting the adversary sort of take over or come in or inject himself into the places. And she is always, from the historical records I've seen, always seeking to do good. And whether that be, like I said, taking excess produce and giving it to people, taking care of the sick, helping women in childbirth. There's just example after example of her doing good deeds and never being idle, and her taking the opportunity to testify of her faith sort of whenever she can and in whatever venues she can. There's a couple of, towards the end of her life, there's a couple of accounts of her being a speaker at old folks' days. They're celebrating these men and women who have lived through all of the hardships of traveling from the East Coast and settling in Salt Lake City or the Salt Lake Valley. And she uses those opportunities to testify of her faith and how she came to be converted to the gospel, and what her life of service and doing her best to build Zion, what that has meant to her. And so I think that she is very well described in verse 31, and her life is a testament that she followed that revelatory counsel for her whole life.
A great promise that she was given to settle down in peace. I can only hope for so much of that in my life, right?
Right. And, I'm sure there were many times in her life where she thought something similar, where she thought, oh, is that going to happen? Am I going to find that peace? Am I going to be able to settle? When she gets to Missouri, just weeks after having heard the words of this revelation and, seeing her community attacked and them, sort of then having to go live as refugees, and then few years later, having to live in, build up Nauvoo. And then a few years after that, having to trek 1,000 miles across the plains. And she's out here driving her own wagon across the plains in a very difficult circumstance. I mean, you can imagine all of these different moments of hardship, her wondering, am I going to get to live and settle down in peace? And she does. And I think she does because of who she was. She was a very resolute, hardworking person, but also because she was faithful, and she did the things that she felt and she believed she needed to do to build Zion and to live a Christ-centered life. And she found that peace. And it is a beautiful promise, and it's a beautiful story.
Brent, how did your testimony of the restoration grow while studying it through her eyes?
Yeah, I think that for me, my testimony has grown over the last 10, 12 years because of what I've observed of Vienna's fortitude, of her faith, of her, stalwartness. She's just an inspiration to me to see somebody who's endured as many obstacles, physical, temporal, even spiritual obstacles that she endured. And for me to see that everyday moving forward, that everyday effort to build Zion gives me strength, and it grows my testimony and the importance of doing the little things, the everyday things to find those ways to contribute to building Zion, but also to just being a disciple, because it's basic, it's small, it's simple. I think that's one of the things for me that Vienna's life shows, and not just Vienna's life. We could say this about if we did a historical research on any number of anonymous, quote unquote, anonymous people from the 19th century to see how they just every day lived their life of faith. That helps me sort of take a step back and see, okay, I'm in the everyday too. And I have an everyday opportunity to make good choices and to follow revelatory counsel and to learn from the scriptures and to try to be like the Savior. It's the everyday that leads to the extraordinary. And I think that for me is what has built my testimony the most in my study of Vienna Jaques.
The everyday leads to the extraordinary. Beautiful way to wrap that out. Thank you so much, Brent Rogers, for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you again to Brent Rogers, the author of The Lord Spoke Her Name, the remarkable story of Vienna Jaques in the Restoration, a book you can find at Deseret bookstores near you or available on the Deseret Bookshelf Plus app, along with a lot of other great podcasts or audiobooks or ebooks, a lot of great books. And this is out of the best books. Thank you for tuning in.